Introduction: a continent without roads, yet not without connections. When we imagine large-scale trade networks, we often picture paved roads stretching across empires, caravans moving along clearly marked routes, or ships crossing well-known seas. In this familiar story of world history, connectivity seems inseparable from infrastructure. Roads, bridges, ports, and later railways. By contrast, pre-Columbian North America has long been portrayed as a land of small, isolated communities, societies living locally, trading little, and remaining largely disconnected from one another. This image, however, is deeply misleading. Long before the arrival of Europeans, and long before the first road was carved into the landscape or the first rail laid across the plains, North America was already connected. It was not connected by stone highways or iron tracks, but by rivers, social relationships, ritual obligations, and shared cultural meanings. Across forests, floodplains, mountains, and coastlines, people exchanged goods, ideas, symbols, and power. Together, these exchanges formed what we now call the Mississippian Trade Network, a continent-wide system of interaction that bound distant regions into a single, dynamic world. Understanding this network requires us to rethink what connection really means. Connectivity does not depend solely on technology. It depends on human organization, on trust, on shared values, and on the ability to move information and materials across space. The Mississippian world demonstrates that complex systems of exchange can emerge even in the absence of wheeled transport, written contracts, or monetary currency. The Mississippian Trade Network flourished roughly between the 9th and 16th centuries, during a period when large, densely populated societies emerged across the Mississippi River Basin and beyond. These societies were not marginal or primitive. They were capable of supporting cities, organizing large-scale construction projects, managing agricultural surpluses, and sustaining long-distance trade over hundreds and even thousands of kilometers. What makes this network especially remarkable is its scale. Copper from the Great Lakes traveled south. Marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico moved deep inland. Obsidian from the western regions appeared in communities far from any volcano. These materials did not move randomly. They followed established routes, passed through trusted hands, and carried meanings that went far beyond their practical use. Trade in the Mississippian world was never just about material exchange. It was also about power, identity, and belief. Exotic goods reinforced social hierarchies. Ritual objects connected communities through shared cosmologies. Artistic styles and symbols spread alongside raw materials, creating a sense of cultural unity across vast distances. In this way, trade acted as both an economic system and a social glue. In this lecture, we will explore how the Mississippian Trade Network functioned, why it was possible without roads or railways, and what it reveals about the societies that sustained it. We will examine the civilization that stood at its center, the geography that made such connections possible, the goods that moved across the continent, and the cultural transformations that followed in their wake. Ultimately, this story challenges a powerful assumption in historical thinking, that large-scale connectivity is a uniquely modern achievement. The Mississippian world reminds us that a continent can be deeply connected even when those connections leave no straight lines on a map, only rivers, artifacts, and enduring traces of human cooperation. The Mississippian civilization as the foundation of a continental trade network. To understand how a continent-wide trade network could exist without roads or railways, we must first understand the civilization that made it possible. The Mississippian world was not a loose collection of villages. It was a complex, organized, and highly adaptive system of societies whose economic and political foundations supported long-distance exchange. The Mississippian civilization emerged around the 9th century CE and spread across much of what is now the central and southeastern United States. Its development was closely tied to the widespread adoption of intensive maize agriculture. Corn, along with beans and squash, provided a stable and highly productive food base. This agricultural surplus allowed populations to grow, settlements to become permanent, and labor to be redirected toward construction, craftsmanship, ritual activity, and trade. As food production increased, so did social complexity. Mississippian societies were typically organized as chiefdoms, hierarchical political systems led by powerful elites. These leaders did not rule by force alone. Their authority was reinforced through religion, ceremony, and control over resources. Trade, in particular, became a critical instrument of power. Access to rare and distant materials distinguished elites from commoners and visually demonstrated their ability to command networks that extended far beyond the local community. At the heart of this civilization stood major urban and ceremonial centers. The most famous and influential of these was Cahokia, located near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers. At its height, Cahokia was an extraordinary place. A sprawling city with massive earthen mounds, large public plazas, and a population comparable to the largest cities of medieval Europe north of the Alps. Cahokia was not only a political and religious capital, it was also a central node in the Mississippian Trade Network. Its strategic position along major rivers made it a natural hub for the movement of goods and people. From here, materials flowed outward to surrounding regions, while exotic resources arrived from distant lands. The city functioned as a point of concentration, redistribution, and symbolic power. Beyond Cahokia, dozens of regional centers played similar roles on a smaller scale. These settlements were often marked by platform mounds, large, flat-topped earthworks that supported temples, elite residences, or council structures. The construction of these mounds required coordinated labor and centralized planning, further evidence of strong leadership and social organization. Importantly, these centers were not isolated competitors. They were connected through networks of alliance, ritual obligation, and exchange. Trade helped maintain diplomatic relationships between communities, reduced conflict, and integrated distant regions into a shared system. A community's participation in long-distance exchange was not optional. It was a key element of political legitimacy and cultural belonging. The Mississippian world, therefore, should not be imagined as a static or uniform civilization. It was dynamic and diverse, with local traditions and regional variations. Yet beneath this diversity lay a common structure: agricultural surplus, hierarchical leadership, ceremonial centers, and long-distance trade. These elements together formed the foundation of a system capable of linking a continent without relying on formal infrastructure. By recognizing the Mississippian civilization as the backbone of this trade network, we begin to see that connectivity was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate social organization, shared cultural values, and the strategic use of geography. In the next section, we will turn our attention to that geography, to the rivers and landscapes that served as the invisible highways of the Mississippian world. Geography of the trade network, connecting a continent. No trade network, no matter how well organized, can exist without geography. In the Mississippian world, geography was not an obstacle to connection. It was the very mechanism that made connection possible. Rivers, floodplains, and natural corridors shaped the movement of people and goods, turning the North American landscape into a vast, integrated system of exchange. At the center of this system stood the Mississippi River, one of the largest and most navigable river systems in the world. Flowing from the northern woodlands to the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi and its countless tributaries formed a natural transportation network unmatched in scale. Long before modern engineering, these waterways functioned as efficient, reliable routes that connected distant ecological zones and cultural regions. Travel by river was faster and less physically demanding than overland movement through forests and wetlands. Canoes could carry heavy cargoes over long distances, allowing goods to circulate far beyond their places of origin. Even against the current, travel was possible by paddling, poling, or following seasonal flows. In this sense, rivers were not barriers. They were corridors of communication. The Mississippi River was joined by major tributaries such as the Ohio, Missouri, and Tennessee rivers, each extending the network into new regions. Through these waterways, Mississippian communities were linked to the Great Lakes in the north, the Appalachian Mountains in the east, the Great Plains in the west, and the Gulf Coast in the south. This created a web of connections that spanned much of the continent's interior. What is especially striking is the diversity of environments tied together by this network. Copper-rich northern regions, shell-producing coastal areas, fertile agricultural valleys, and resource-scarce uplands all became interdependent. Trade allowed communities to overcome local limitations by accessing materials unavailable in their immediate surroundings. In doing so, it encouraged specialization and regional identities within a shared economic framework. It is important to note that trade did not always involve direct, long-distance journeys by a single group. Instead, goods often moved step by step through a chain of exchanges. A shell from the Gulf Coast might pass through several communities before reaching a northern settlement. Each transfer reinforced social ties, obligations, and alliances. Distance, rather than weakening connection, multiplied relationships. Overland routes also played a role, particularly in regions where rivers were less accessible. Trails followed ridgelines, valleys, and animal paths, linking river systems to one another. These paths were not random. They were known, maintained, and remembered through oral tradition and repeated use. In this way, the Mississippian landscape functioned as an organic infrastructure. Without roads, bridges, or signs, people navigated through shared knowledge of terrain and seasonal rhythms. Geography and culture worked together, transforming the natural environment into a connected world. Understanding this geographic foundation helps explain how the Mississippian Trade Network could achieve such scale and resilience. The rivers did not merely support trade, they structured it. They determined where major centers emerged, how goods moved, and which regions became central or peripheral. In the next section, we will examine what exactly moved along these waterways. The goods, materials, and objects that gave the trade network its meaning and power. Goods, resources, and the meaning of exchange. The true scale of the Mississippian Trade Network becomes most visible through the objects it carried. Unlike roads or written records, these objects remain in the ground, waiting to be discovered. When archaeologists uncover materials far from their natural sources, they reveal not only movement, but intention, choices about what was valuable, meaningful, and worth transporting across great distances. Among the most striking of these materials is copper. Native copper deposits were abundant in the region of the Great Lakes, yet copper artifacts appear throughout the Mississippian world, hundreds and sometimes thousands of kilometers to the south. These were not crude tools made for everyday labor. They were carefully shaped ornaments, plates, and symbolic objects. Their value lay not in practical utility, but in their rarity and visual power. Obsidian offers another compelling example. This volcanic glass does not occur naturally in the Mississippi River basin, yet obsidian blades and fragments have been found in Mississippian contexts far from any volcanic source. Its sharpness made it desirable, but its true significance likely lay in its exotic origin. To possess obsidian was to possess evidence of connection to distant, almost mythical landscapes. Marine shells, especially large conch shells from the Gulf of Mexico, traveled deep into the continental interior. These shells were transformed into beads, pendants, cups, and engraved gorgets. Their bright surfaces and unfamiliar forms made them ideal materials for ritual and display. In inland communities, such objects embodied the idea of the faraway, the sea made visible in a land of rivers and forests. Yet trade was not limited to exotic prestige goods. More common items also circulated: high-quality stone for tools, distinctive ceramic styles, pigments, feathers, and possibly textiles and agricultural products. While organic materials rarely survive archaeologically, their absence should not be mistaken for insignificance. Everyday trade sustained regional economies and reinforced habitual contact between neighboring communities. Crucially, goods in the Mississippian world carried meaning beyond their material form. Objects were embedded in social relationships. Receiving a rare item often implied obligation, alliance, or loyalty. Giving such an item enhanced the status of the giver and reinforced their position within the social hierarchy. Trade, therefore, was never neutral, it was deeply political. Prestige goods played a particularly important role in elite power. Leaders controlled access to rare materials and distributed them strategically during ceremonies and public events. This redistribution created visible inequality, but also social cohesion. By tying wealth to ritual and authority, Mississippian elites transformed trade into a tool of governance. In this system, value was not fixed by market prices. It was negotiated through tradition, symbolism, and social context. A copper plate or shell gorget was valuable not because of scarcity alone, but because of what it represented: distant connections, spiritual power, and the legitimacy of leadership. Thus, the movement of goods across the Mississippian landscape was also the movement of meaning. Objects told stories of where they came from, who controlled them, and why they mattered. To follow these objects is to trace the invisible threads that bound communities together. Having explored what was exchanged, we now turn to how exchange itself was organized. Without money, contracts, or formal marketplaces, how did such a vast system function? The answer lies in social structure, ritual, and power. How trade worked without money, markets, or roads. The effectiveness of the Mississippian Trade Network raises an essential question. How did such an extensive system operate without money, written contracts, or formal marketplaces? The answer lies in the social foundations of exchange. Trade in the Mississippian world was not primarily an economic transaction. It was a social process embedded in ritual, hierarchy, and mutual obligation. At the most basic level, exchange often took the form of gift-giving. Gifts were not simple acts of generosity. They created relationships, To receive a valuable object was to accept a bond, an expectation of future reciprocity, and recognition of shared status or alliance. In this way, trade reinforced long-term connections rather than one-time transactions. Ritual played a central role in organizing exchange. Ceremonies, feasts, and seasonal gatherings brought together leaders and representatives from multiple communities. These events provided opportunities for the public display of wealth, the redistribution of goods, and the reaffirmation of political relationships. Trade was thus inseparable from religion and ceremony. It was performed as much as it was conducted. Elite control was another defining feature of the system. Chiefs and high-ranking individuals acted as gatekeepers of long-distance trade. They controlled access to exotic materials and decided when and how these goods were distributed. This control strengthened their authority, as it demonstrated their ability to mobilize resources from afar and maintain connections beyond the local community. Redistribution was especially important. Elites accumulated goods not to hoard them indefinitely, but to give them away at strategic moments. By redistributing wealth, leaders converted material resources into loyalty, prestige, and social stability. Trade networks, therefore, were sustained not by profit, but by reputation and power. The role of intermediaries should not be underestimated. Certain individuals or groups likely specialized in travel and negotiation. They carried not only goods, but information, news of distant events, changes in alliances, or ritual knowledge. Their journeys required trust and diplomatic skill, as safe passage depended on recognized relationships between communities. Despite the absence of formal infrastructure, the system was remarkably resilient. Social norms regulated behavior, and violations of trust could carry serious consequences, including exclusion from exchange networks. In a world where access to trade meant access to prestige and resources, maintaining one's reputation was essential. This form of trade challenges modern assumptions about efficiency and organization. It demonstrates that complex economic systems do not require centralized markets or currency. Instead, they can emerge from social bonds, shared values, and deeply embedded cultural practices. Having explored the mechanics of exchange, we now turn to its broader consequences. Trade reshaped not only economies but cultures. Through sustained interaction, Mississippian societies developed shared symbols, beliefs, and identities that spread across the continent. Cultural exchange and the creation of a shared world. The movement of goods across the Mississippian Trade Network did more than redistribute material resources. It reshaped how people understood the world and their place within it. As objects traveled, so too did ideas, stories, symbols, and religious concepts. Over time, these shared elements created a cultural landscape that extended far beyond any single community or region. Archaeologists have identified a broad set of artistic and symbolic traditions known as the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. This complex is not a single religion or belief system, but a constellation of shared motifs, rituals, and iconography that appear across much of the Mississippian world. These symbols are found engraved on shell gorgets, embossed on copper plates, and painted on pottery from widely separated regions. Among the most recognizable motifs is the so-called Birdman figure, a powerful, often winged or feathered human form associated with warfare, authority, and the upper world of Mississippian cosmology. Solar imagery, cross and circle designs, and representations of sacred animals also appear repeatedly. The widespread presence of these images suggests a shared symbolic language understood across cultural boundaries. Trade played a crucial role in this process. Ritual objects carried not only materials but meaning. When a copper plate or shell ornament arrived in a new community, it brought with it a visual vocabulary and a set of associated ideas. Local artisans sometimes adapted these symbols to regional styles, but the underlying concepts remained recognizable. This balance between unity and variation strengthened cultural cohesion without erasing diversity. Shared ceremonial practices further reinforced this interconnected world. Feasts, mound-building events, and religious gatherings provided occasions for communities to reaffirm common beliefs and values. Participation in these rituals signaled inclusion in a broader cultural sphere, one that transcended local identities while still respecting regional traditions. Cultural exchange also helped legitimize political authority. Leaders who displayed widely recognized symbols of power could claim not only local dominance, but participation in a larger, sacred order. In this way, trade-supported culture became a tool of governance, linking cosmology and political control. Importantly, this shared world was not imposed by a single center. It emerged through sustained interaction, negotiation, and mutual recognition. The Mississippian Trade Network did not erase boundaries. It overlaid them with connections. Communities remained distinct, but they were no longer isolated. Through trade and cultural exchange, the Mississippian world became more than a collection of societies. It became a system, one in which meaning flowed alongside material goods, and identity was shaped by connection as much as by place. This shared cultural landscape, however, was not permanent. In the final centuries of the Mississippian period, the networks that sustained it began to weaken. To understand why, we must now turn to the factors that led to the transformation and eventual decline of the Mississippian Trade Network. The decline and transformation of the trade network. No system, no matter how expansive or resilient, exists forever. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, signs of strain began to appear across the Mississippian world. The vast trade network that had once bound regions together gradually weakened, and many of the great centers that had anchored it were abandoned or transformed. This decline was not sudden, nor was it caused by a single factor. Rather, it was the result of a complex interaction between environmental, social, and political pressures. One of the most significant internal challenges was population pressure. The success of Mississippian agriculture had led to large, dense settlements, particularly in river valleys. Over time, intensive farming depleted soils and reduced productivity. Forests were cleared for fields and construction, increasing erosion and altering local ecosystems. As resources became scarcer, competition intensified, placing stress on the systems that had once promoted cooperation. Social and political tensions also played a role. Hierarchical societies depend on the ability of elites to maintain legitimacy and control. When trade networks weakened or access to prestige goods became less reliable, the symbolic foundations of elite authority were undermined. In some regions, this may have led to internal conflict, fragmentation, or the breakdown of centralized leadership. Climate change further exacerbated these problems. The onset of cooler and more unpredictable weather patterns, often associated with the period known as the Little Ice Age, affected crop yields and increased the risk of famine. In an interconnected system, localized failures could ripple outward, disrupting trade routes and alliances. By the time Europeans arrived in the 16th century, many Mississippian centers were already in decline. However, early contact intensified existing disruptions. European diseases, introduced long before sustained settlement through indirect contact, devastated indigenous populations. The loss of people meant the loss of knowledge, labor, and social cohesion, all essential components of long-distance trade. As a result, the once integrated network gave way to more localized systems of exchange. Large ceremonial centers were abandoned, and populations dispersed into smaller, more mobile communities. Yet it is important to emphasize that this was not a collapse into chaos. Mississippian traditions persisted, adapted, and continued to shape the cultures of later indigenous societies. The transformation of the trade network marks not an end, but a transition. It reflects the vulnerability of complex systems to environmental and social stress, as well as their capacity for adaptation. To fully appreciate the significance of the Mississippian Trade Network, we must now step back and consider what it reveals about the broader history of North America. Why the Mississippian Trade Network matters. The story of the Mississippian Trade Network is not only a regional history, it is a challenge to how we understand civilization itself. For a long time, the history of North America before European contact was treated as a prelude, a quiet background waiting for real history to begin. The evidence of a continent-wide trade network forces us to abandon that narrative. First and foremost, the Mississippian world demonstrates that complex societies can flourish without the technologies often considered essential to civilization. There were no paved roads, no wheeled transport, no writing system, and no coined money. Yet there were cities, monumental architecture, long-distance trade, and shared religious systems. Organization, cooperation, and cultural knowledge proved just as powerful as infrastructure. In this sense, the Mississippian Trade Network can be meaningfully compared to other great systems of exchange in world history. Like the Silk Road of Eurasia or the maritime networks of the Mediterranean, it connected distant regions, encouraged specialization, and facilitated the flow of ideas. The difference lies not in sophistication, but in form. Mississippian connectivity was built on rivers, ritual, and social obligation rather than stone roads and imperial administration. The network also reshapes our understanding of indigenous history. It highlights indigenous agency, innovation, and adaptability. The people of the Mississippian world were not passive inhabitants of a landscape. They actively shaped their environment and their relationships with one another. Trade was a deliberate strategy, not an accidental byproduct of proximity. Equally important is the legacy of this system. Many later indigenous societies inherited elements of Mississippian social organization, ceremonial practice, and regional interaction. Even after the great centers were abandoned, the memory of these connections endured in oral traditions, artistic styles, and social norms. Finally, the Mississippian Trade Network invites us to reconsider modern assumptions about connection and progress. It reminds us that human networks do not need rigid infrastructure to be powerful. Trust, shared meaning, and cooperation can bind vast spaces together just as effectively as roads and rails. In studying this network, we do more than reconstruct a forgotten system of exchange. We recover a vision of North America as it once was, not fragmented and isolated, but deeply connected. A continent linked by water, culture, and human relationships long before the modern world took shape. Conclusion: a continent connected without roads or rails. As we come to the end of this lecture, it is worth returning to the central idea that has guided our exploration. Long before roads, railways, or modern infrastructure, North America was already deeply connected. The Mississippian Trade Network reveals a continent shaped not by isolation, but by movement of goods, people, ideas, and beliefs. We have seen that this network rested on strong foundations. Agricultural surplus supported dense populations and powerful centers. Rivers functioned as natural highways, turning geography into opportunity rather than limitation. Trade moved far beyond local exchange, linking distant regions into a single system of interaction. Exotic materials such as copper, shells, and obsidian became visible proof of these connections, while everyday goods sustained regional economies. More importantly, trade was never just economic. It was social, political, and spiritual. Exchange created obligations, reinforced alliances, and legitimized authority. Through shared symbols and rituals, Mississippian societies developed a common cultural language that crossed regional boundaries. A person living hundreds of kilometers away could recognize the same sacred imagery and understand its meaning. In this shared understanding, we see the true depth of continental connection. The eventual decline of the Mississippian Trade Network does not diminish its significance. Like all complex systems, it was vulnerable to environmental stress, social change, and historical disruption. Yet its influence did not disappear. Elements of Mississippian culture continued to shape indigenous societies long after the great centers were abandoned, leaving a lasting imprint on the history of the continent. Ultimately, the Mississippian world challenges us to rethink how we define civilization and progress. It reminds us that connectivity does not require steel, asphalt, or written contracts. It requires cooperation, shared meaning, and the ability to imagine oneself as part of a larger world. Seen through this lens, the Mississippian Trade Network is not a forgotten curiosity of the past. It is a powerful example of human ingenuity, a reminder that a continent can be connected not by roads or rails, but by relationships.